I would like to take a moment before we get into today's main episode and to talk about my sponsor for the podcast. Podmatch is a new podcasting site dedicated to all podcasters. The platform helps hosts get connected with potential guests to appear on their show, as well as allow guests to find podcasts that will give them a chance to share their story. Podmatch offers many tools to help organize your page, from to-do lists to episode planning to potentially appearing on a leaderboard. Podmatch has it all. The best part, you have the potential to get paid. And who doesn't like to get paid from home? I like to. With an easy sign up, you can start connecting with podcasters and guests immediately. I have been a part of Podmatch since the beginning of May, and I have got to say that it was the best decision I've ever made because Podmatch helps your podcast grow. It helps you get connected with people that have very interesting, very compelling background stories that are just waiting for their story to be shared. So if you are a host or guest and would like to start building professional relationships, explore more opportunities, and have your story shared, I highly suggest that you sign up with Podmatch today by going to joinpodmatch.com/lethal venom to start expanding your network in seconds. I would like to give another huge thank you to Podmatch for sponsoring this episode. Now on to our main episode, and again, you can sign up at joinpodmatch.com/lethal venom to begin your podcasting journey today. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Lethal Venom Podcast. This is a show where I talk about anything I want with the honest to God truth and the lies told. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Bruce Chalmer. He is a psychologist in Vermont who has been working with couples for over 30 years. Through his teaching, consulting, writing, podcasts, and videos about relationships, his ideas have helped thousands of couples and their therapists. He is the author of 3 books. He is married with his wife, educator Judy Alexander, and they're both the co-hosts of Couples Therapy in 7 Words, which is a podcast. His other notable interests include musical composition, choral singing, and directing. In his composition, he had a composition back in 2005 that was recorded. He has served in leadership positions in several Jewish communities in Vermont as well. So I want to give a huge shout out and welcome to Dr. Chalmer. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for doing this. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So if you could just tell me a little bit about yourself and a little bit about what you do.
Yeah, sure. So as you mentioned, I'm a psychologist. I've been focusing mostly on couples therapy. I've been in private practice for over 30 years now, focusing on couples therapy for the last good bit of that, especially. The more I did it, the more I enjoy working with couples. It's hard work, but it's really inspiring work. When I see people dealing with really hard stuff and facing it with courage, and I help them do that, and it really is inspiring. And, sometimes they stay together and sometimes they split up, but either way, often, if they're feeling better, if they're feeling less panicked, if they're feeling like they've come up with solutions that work for them, it feels, as I say, feels like something of a calling. Sort of feels like helping make the world better. If you heal a family, you're sort of healing a little bit of the world, and we're all in families one way or another. So it's just a generally good thing to do. So you mentioned I've written a few books on the subject. I've been doing that. I did a whole bunch of videos maybe 15, 20 years ago and really enjoyed it. And then about, I don't know, 6, 7 years ago, I realized I think I had a book in there somewhere. And that's how I came out with my first book. And I will also mention the publication date of my book, Reigniting the Spark, which was the first of those 3 books. Um, that was February 29th, 2020. Now, if you think back to February 29th, 2020, leap day of 2020, that was right when everything shut down. That's right when COVID was happening. So we couldn't do any in-person, book promotion events. So my wife and I figured, well, let's do a Facebook uh, live book launch. And we did that, and people said, "Oh, you guys seem to have a good time together. Why don't you do a podcast?" And we've been doing it ever since. So that's how we came to do our podcast.
What have been some huge insights and key elements of doing couples therapy that you've learned over the years doing it?
I like the way you asked that question because I've learned over the years doing it. That's how I've learned it. And everybody has their own way of going about it. You get the training you get, and then the way you learn how to do it in a way that actually fits who I as an individual therapist actually am, is by doing it. So what have I learned by doing it? What I've come to recognize, and this is, believe it or not, this is not deviating from your question, it's actually part of it. The title of the podcast my wife and I do is Couples Therapy in 7 Words. Well, that's sort of a funny, 7 words? What are the 7 words? Well, I'll tell you what the 7 words are. In fact, for people who are actually watching this, I imagine more people are listening than watching, but I actually have it on a cup. Those are the 7 words. Be kind, don't panic, and have faith. And the relevance of that to your question about, like what, how does one do therapy? I came up with that little expression in response to a question from a colleague like 25 years ago when we were on our way out of a consultation group meeting. And he said, "How do you do couples therapy anyway?" And I said, "I suppose that's basically what I'm telling people." And what I mean by that is the people who are kind to each other in the sense of still recognizing their sense of kinship, that kind of kindness. They're the ones who want to stay together. If you're in a panic, you can't do that. If you're in a panic, you're not able to be kind in that sense. Too much of your brain is focusing on fight or flight or freeze. So it's very difficult to maintain that sense of kindness if you're panicking. The couples that seem to be able to get through hard stuff are the ones that manifest what I call faith. And I don't just mean any particular religious faith at all. I don't mean it isn't even necessarily religious. It's the couples that are willing to say, wow, this is painful, but there must be something meaningful about it. We're going to have to look at it rather than deny it. So a couple comes in and there's been infidelity, which is probably close to half of the couples I work with. There's been infidelity. So they come in, they're dealing with infidelity, and the couples that come in and say, "Oh my God, this is terrible." The one who cheated is saying, "It's terrible. I'll never do it again. I don't know what happened to me." And the other person saying, "Yeah, damn right it's terrible. And you better not do it again. And let's go back to how it was. It was fine. Let's go back to how it was." Those couples don't do well. They're going to have to find a way of recognizing, no, the way it was is what led you to where you got to. That's not going to work. So it's the couples that came in and said, "This is incredibly painful. You know, I'm really angry. I'm really hurt. I'm really ashamed, all the things that they're feeling. But we better look at it carefully because apparently there was something not working right and we didn't realize it." Those couples are showing what I call faith. It's the faith that says this whole reality business is right to be what it is, even when it's painful. There's something there we better look at as meaningful. That's the kind of faith that when couples are showing that, they tend to do well. And what I'm trying to offer them probably more than any of my clever techniques and anything else that any therapist ever learns to do, what I'm trying to offer them is that sense of faith. It's like, well, you're not crazy, you're not evil, you're not stupid, which is true of almost every couple I work with. They're not crazy, they're not evil, they're not stupid. So they may have done bad things. They may have, gotten upset and acted a little crazy. Who knows what they've done? But fundamentally, they're valid to be who they are. There must be something meaningful about this. Let's work on that. And then they can get better.
Over the years you've done couples therapy, is there like one overall reoccurring theme that's a huge problem or setback in a relationship?
There's some stuff that's kind of been around forever. I mean, when I mentioned infidelity, the way people do infidelity has changed over the last 30 years. There's so many more opportunities to do things that people can think of as infidelity than there were, 30 years ago. The internet, that has changed the nature of infidelity a lot, but the fact of infidelity has been around forever. So that's not so different. I'll tell you what I've kind of abstracted from my work that seems to be, well, this is something I share with pretty much every couple in the first session. If you think about what you're trying to accomplish by being in a couple, if you think about what makes a couple want to stay together, it's when there are two sets of needs that are adequately fulfilled. And the reason I talk about two sets is that the skills you need for one are very different from the skills you need for the other. Well, the two sets what I'm talking about are stability and intimacy. Stability is all about keeping the anxiety level low. Stability is about like not cheating, stability is about not being drunk too much, that sort of thing. A lot of stuff can be destabilizing, And the couples that are good at stability have usually figured that out pretty well. Most of the couples I work with are pretty good at stability. They're having worries about it, or they wouldn't be talking to me. They're worried about their relationship, but mostly they're pretty good at that stuff. They're not crazy. They're pretty good at figuring out, what they need to do to not push each other's buttons too much. The problems most of the couples I'm having are not on the stability side, they're on the intimacy side. What I mean by intimacy, and here I'm using the term quite broadly. I don't just mean sex, I mean more broadly. Intimacy is when you are present and honest with yourself and each other. It's a feeling of being alive. And most of the couples I'm working with, that's where their problems are because they've deadened part of themselves in order to avoid rocking the boat too much. And so they end up fighting about everything and anything except what they're really afraid to talk about because that would be too intimate. And so a lot of the work with couples is helping them tolerate the anxiety of actually being honest with themselves and each other. So that's a very overall kind of theme, but I think as I say, most of the couples I deal with, it's more about that than it is about, it's not like they haven't figured out how to pay bills, or they haven't figured out they may be having trouble paying bills, they may be having financial difficulties, but it's most of their relational issues aren't because they don't have the basic skills down in that domain. It's mostly that they're terrified of talking to each other honestly.
Is there a way that couples can recover from betrayal, and is forgiveness possible at all?
Yeah. That's a great question. That's the subject of my most recent book, actually, Betrayal and Forgiveness. Yeah. Now I can make a glib statement. Forgiveness is possible. First of all, I better define what I mean by forgiveness because, sometimes when people use the word forgiveness, that what they mean is, well, if I forgive somebody who cheated on me or forgive somebody who hurt me or whatever, I guess I'm saying I'll restore the relationship and move on and act like it's okay. And I don't mean forgiveness that way. I mean forgiveness in a much different way. I mean forgiveness as an inside job. I just saw this on TV the other night. I think it might have been last night or the night before. That guy who murdered four students in was it Idaho or something? Anyway, he had pled guilty. He was being sentenced, and so the family members of the people he killed were making statements, and one of them said, I want you to know I've forgiven you because I can't keep the poison in me. That's what I mean by forgiveness. I'm not saying everybody can do that, by the way. I'm not saying everybody can pull that off all the time, but forgiveness in the sense of saying, well, it was the novelist Anne Lamott that lots of people like to quote this particular quote because it's a really good one. She said, "To not forgive is like drinking rat poison and waiting for the rat to die." What forgiveness does is gets the poison out of you. So you don't have to hate the person anymore. You don't have to even be angry at the person anymore. Doesn't mean that you have any intention of restoring the relationship. When I talk about forgiveness, I think forgiveness is a really important step in recovering from betrayal, but it doesn't mean you're going to stay together. It doesn't mean you trust the other person. It doesn't mean you ever want to see the other person again. It means you get to the point where you're not panicked every time you think about it. That's what I mean by forgiveness. So yeah, forgiveness, that forgiveness is it's possible. It's not possible if you still need the anger. Do you know what I mean? If you're in a relationship where you're still being hurt, that's not the time to forgive. That's the time to pay attention to the fact that you're feeling like this is intolerable. I better get out. But if you're in a relationship where, you're at least physically safe and you want to think about the possibility of staying together, you're going to need to find a way to get the anger out so that you're not burdened by it. And the way to do that is tricky. A whole section in the book is about, how do you manage that? How can you forgive? How do you forgive? And a lot of it starts, well, I talk about three steps, which if you want to, we can go into, but it's beware of authors who say there are three steps to anything, like I've just said, because I make it sound so simple. It isn't that simple. But I don't know. Do you want to, is that where you want to go? We can go there.
We can dive into that, yeah.
Yeah. So when I talk about three steps of forgiveness, step one is forgiving yourself. And sometimes people say, wait a minute, that no good so and so is the one who cheated on me. Why do I have to forgive myself? Well, we always partly blame ourselves when we get hurt. If for nothing else, then saying, why didn't I see it coming? You know, why did I trust him or why did I trust her? Why didn't I protect myself from this? What's the matter with me? Why was I so blind? Why was I so stupid? All of that stuff. We beat up on ourselves. And if you do that, it doesn't help you think clearly about what's going on. You need to be able to forgive yourself is basically saying, wait a second, I only knew what I knew. I didn't know what I didn't know. I only knew what I knew when I knew it. If I had known that my partner was going to cheat on me, yes, I would have acted differently, but I didn't. If I could have seen it, yeah, was I deluding myself to not see it? Well, maybe I was, but I had reasons for doing that. Forgiving yourself is about recognizing, I guess I was doing the best I could. You know, I wish I had done better, but knowing what I knew, I was doing the best I could. So that's step one. If you can forgive yourself, it's a pretty short step to forgiving whoever hurt you, which is step two. It's like, well, I wish they hadn't done what they did, but given who they were, given what they were thinking, given whatever resentments they had brewing, given whatever, you know, crazy understandings they were having, I guess they were doing the best they could too. That's what they came up with. And so, if you can forgive yourself, you can also extend that forgiveness to the other person. You can say, well, I don't have to be angry at you, but I don't know if I can trust you, but I don't have to be angry anymore. Let's figure this out. And then the third step, I give a funny name to, and you don't have to be religious to appreciate this name, though if you are, you'll appreciate it. But even if you're not, I call it forgive God. Now, what do I mean when when I say forgive God? It means forgive the fact that we live in a world where this kind of stuff can happen, where no matter how hard we try, we can't always protect ourselves. People do sometimes do hurtful things. That's just the way the world works. We're going to have to accept that. There's something about that that's right to be that way. It wouldn't work. You know, this is the classic problem that theologians talk about. There's a name for it among theologians. It's called theodicy. Have you ever heard that word, theodicy? It's the problem of how could a good God let bad things happen to good people? How could a good God let there be a tsunami that wipes out, tens of thousands of innocent people? You know, the classic answer to that is free will. It's like, no, we have to have free will means we're capable of doing evil as well as good, and it has to be that way. So how could God let me get hurt that way? Well, because it happens. That's like, yeah, it's more complex than that. We can't possibly understand all the complexities. We're kind of stuck with that. To forgive that, then you can at least calm down and then say, all right, now what do I do about this relationship? So forgiveness, I think, is a really important part of recovering from betrayal. It doesn't guarantee that you're going to be able to trust the person. That takes both parties. So that's basically what I mean. So the very short answer to your question is forgiveness possible? Yeah, I think it is. I think it's more than possible. I think it's actually necessary, not prematurely. You can't do it too soon. You can only do it when you're ready. But it's an important part of healing.
So, how can a couple rebuild trust after a betrayal?
Yeah. That's kind of the next step. It's like, all right, if you're with somebody and there's been a betrayal and you want to rebuild trust, how do you go about doing that? And it's difficult work. It's doable. It's difficult work. What you have to be able to get to is a level of understanding that says, wow, what happened before was in a particular context, and we've learned what we needed to learn. We've grown the ways we've needed to grow so that we're no longer in that context. And, for the person who was the one who was betrayed, they have to figure out, can I can I be with someone and think of that person as a good person, as a valid person, as a person who could love me, even though they did that in the past? Can I wrap my brain around that? And sometimes people can, and sometimes they can't. Sometimes it's like, wow, I can even understand why you cheated. I get it, in ways I didn't get it before. I don't like it, but I can understand it. But I can't be with you. I can't be with a husband or a wife who cheated on me. I've met folks like that. I've met other folks who feel like, wow, I see where that came from. We are so much better off now. I don't have to worry about that. This is what trust means. I don't have to worry about that anymore because we would see the signs. I know I would, and I think you would too. And we would address it before it would get to that point. So there are ways to rebuild trust, but it takes both parties. And it's interesting because even the person who did the betraying has to be able to trust the other person. Not so much that they wouldn't betray them that way, because they hadn't, but they have to be able to trust that the other person could forgive them. They have to be able to trust that the other person wouldn't think of them as a permanent villain or, be their permanent probation officer. Nobody wants to live like that. So takes both parties rebuilding trust. And one of the great ironies that I always love to point out is, what helps a couple build trust with each other? It's not it's not just lovely moments together, which of course is great. When people have these, they reconnect and they feel good about each other and they have lots of nice experiences together. That's all great. That doesn't really help them build or not build trust. What helps them build trust is when somebody says something to you that they know you don't want to hear. Because they're trusting, they're saying, look, I'm taking a risk here. You may not want to hear this, but I want to tell you this. And they're being honest, because why would they risk your displeasure if they didn't have a good reason? They're risking the anxiety. That's what builds trust. So when people can be honest with each other and recognize, wow, if something's bothering you, you're actually going to tell me. I don't like, bummer hearing it. I may not agree with you, but at least you're honest, that builds trust.
So you've talked about faith and how faith is a way for couples to kind of get back on terms. So how has your own faith influenced how you work with couples?
Yeah. A lot. That's a short answer, isn't it? Yeah, in the sense that I'm not talking about a sort of fundamentalist faith that would say, well, it has to be this way. And you mentioned, and I mentioned, I'm Jewish and very active in the Jewish community. I think actually it's interesting. A particular aspect of Judaism that I think is has a lot to do with this. Um, it's the willingness to look at multiple truths simultaneously, some of which are even a bit in conflict, and recognize we're not going to be able to resolve all the conflict, but it's interesting. The interplay of those contradictory things is often really um, it's really generative. To be able to tolerate that without freaking out, that's a particular aspect of Jewish culture, I think, is an important part of it for me. But the vast majority of folks I work with aren't Jewish. I live in an area. I live in Vermont. I live in an area where the Jewish community is quite small. So it's not like I know every Jewish person in this area, but I know a lot of them, and so I couldn't work with them as a therapist. So in any case, just in terms of population, the vast majority of folks I work with are, if they have any faith at all, it's almost always Christian. Once in a while, some Muslims, but mostly they're Christians. And so this also appeals, I think, to a lot of the Christians that I work with, because they know perfectly well that I'm not a Christian, I'm Jewish. But that sense of recognizing, first of all, I'm comfortable talking with people about faith. I'm comfortable if people will say, well, what would Jesus do? I don't happen to be Christian, but I'm totally comfortable hearing people speak in those terms. It's really meaningful. And I'm really comfortable with that, the sort of multiple possibilities thing. So that's kind of a way that my own faith plays into it.
You've talked about the death spiral for passion. How does that
Mm.
happen?
Yeah, that's what I was talking before about stability and intimacy. The way that happens is, as people get together, a couple meets and they have all this chemistry going and there's a lot of passion going, and they feel all this intense attraction and they're just fascinated with each other because they don't know much about each other. And that's lovely. That's a lovely way to feel. And so then they decide they're going to form a family. They move together, they get married, they have kids. Having kids especially way ups the ante on stability. They want to make sure that things stay stable. And even without kids, to have someone in your life that you've partnered with and it feels like, wow, I don't want this to go away. I want this to keep feeling good. So what will happen over time is they will often start to worry about raising anxiety. Something as simple as a complaint, a garden variety complaint, to say to your partner, hey, I wish you would do X, Y, or Z that you're not doing, or I wish you wouldn't do X, Y, or Z that you're doing. It's going to raise anxiety. It's like, uh-oh, how are they going to hear me? And if a couple has had the experience where somebody raises a complaint and the other person takes it personally and responds defensively and they get angry and they yell at each other, they are trained, uh-oh, don't raise a complaint. And what happens over time is the things that you sit there being, stewing about never get addressed. And so now a little thing becomes huge. And it's not just complaints that people will avoid if things have gone poorly. They'll start to avoid, for example, saying something about their dreams or their fantasies or their, things that they've wondered about, or, speaking about their deep emotions. They won't talk about that with their partner. And over time, that becomes kind of deadening. So when I talk about the death cycle, the death spiral for passion, it's because people are afraid to open up the anxiety that intimacy sometimes is about. And so the symptoms of that, well, what are the symptoms that happen when intimacy is compromised? Sometimes you'll see it, when I ask about a couple, how's your sex life? And sometimes they will say non-existent. Sometimes they'll say still there, but not great. You know, every once in a while I've had a couple that says, no, that's a strong area. We're fine that way, but not in other areas. That's unusual. Usually, if a couple's intimate life more generally is compromised, their sex life isn't so great either. Not always, but often. Sometimes the symptom of a compromised intimacy will be someone will have an affair, or they will just fight about everything and nothing, and they'll fight about trivia and wondering why they're fighting because they're afraid to talk about what's really bothering them. So that's what I mean by the death spiral for passion. It just people will favor stability so much that they will end up compromising intimacy, and it doesn't work. They're both needs.
You have a chapter in one of your books called Sex, Good Sex, and Sacred Sex.
Yeah.
What are the differences between the three?
Yeah, so when I say sex, good sex, and sacred sex, the first one, I also just call that plain old sex. What is plain old sex? Whatever you think it is. I'm not I'm not fussy about how you define it. What if you think it's sex, it's sex. That could be by yourself, that could be with, with a partner, whatever. But plain old sex, the basic skills you need for plain old sex, in effect, it's not to freak out at the very thought of it. And I say that with some respect there because there are people who have been traumatized sexually, especially, sexual abuse or rape or something like that, for whom even plain old sex is incredibly triggering. So even to have plain old sex and not freak out, some people need some therapy or need some kind of work so that they can recover from trauma, so that they're no longer traumatized by past experience. So that's plain old sex. But basically, plain old sex is it's a way of connecting physically. It's a way of deeply connecting physically. To go from plain old sex to what I call good sex, what do I call good sex? I say good sex is when you're not just connecting sexually, you're connecting intimately sexually. By intimately, I don't just mean physically. I mean, the act of sex you could define as an intimate act. But I mean, you're connecting, you're like I was talking about intimacy before, you're present and honest with yourself and each other. So when a couple is having good sex, it's interesting because what's included in good sex is, for example, either party being able to say to the other, "Hey, I don't like what you're doing right now. Do that a little differently, or a little faster, a little slower, or, try this, not that." And to be able to hear that and not freak out. And there's lots and lots of couples I work with where that sort of thing occasions anger. Somebody says, "Hey, I don't like how you're doing that," and they take it personally and get angry, and it it messes it up. So good sex is where there is that basic sense of emotional intimacy as well as physical intimacy. So that's good sex. Now, what do I mean by sacred sex? Well, what do I mean by sacred? The the notion of sacred sex is more about sacred than it is about sex. I mean, I'll bring it back to sex in a bit, but sacredness refers to the idea that what you are engaged in isn't just about you. It's about a bigger, in religious terms, it's like God's involved somehow. The universe is involved somehow. Something much bigger than just us is involved. So sacred sex, the reason I talk about sacred sex, and I'm not the only one, of course, that talks about this, there's whole systems, Tantra is, for example, talks about that sort of thing, where you get in touch with forces that are much bigger than the two of you. That sort of thing is available. And the reason sex is a good domain to talk about that is the forces involved in sex are really quite awe-inspiring if you think about it. Anybody who's ever had an orgasm, if it was positive, if it was in a positive context, most people, I think, the first time are rather awed by it. It's like, wow, these are forces I didn't know existed. And so that makes it very amenable to the notion of being able to say, wow, it's not just us doing this, we're involved in something much bigger. And so it sort of takes you out of yourself. So that's what I mean by sacred sex. And it's not like you can sort of snap your fingers and have that happen. Like any kind of sacred experience, people experience this in prayer too. If you have a practice of praying or a practice of meditation, you are basically you're making fertile soil for moments of sacred experience to happen, but it doesn't mean they're always going to happen. You can't force it. But if you practice it in a way that allows for it, if you're present as much as you can be, that's when that sort of thing can happen. And it's amazing when it happens. It's sort of life-changing when it happens.
Every couple has a level of problems in their relationship. Have there been any instances where therapy has just not worked for them? And is it a is that a sign for couples that if they go to couples therapy and nothing that they is working, is that the sign that they just need to really split up and just call it quits to try to do therapy and try to make the relationship work?
Yeah. It's funny you asked that question. I'm working on another book, and the chapter I happen to be on right now is called How Do You Know When to Call It Quits? I happen to be working on that very chapter. That's a great question. I wouldn't claim if, as a therapist, I wouldn't claim if I'm working with a couple that if this work with me isn't working, that's a sign they should split up. It could be that they need a different therapist. I don't claim to be the best therapist for everybody. Do you know what I mean? No therapist is
No.
the best therapist for everybody. So it
Mhm.
could be, hey, maybe try someone else. Because what you'll get is you'll get a different approach if you go to someone else.
Mhm.
Or maybe therapy isn't the way to do it. Maybe there's other stuff. Again, I wouldn't say just give up necessarily. Having said that, indeed, there are lots of couples I work with end up splitting up, and I don't consider that necessarily a failure of the work. I don't measure success in whether they stay together or not. I measure success. I recognize there's three different opinions of success in couples therapy. There's mine, which is the least important one, and then there's the two people involved, and they may not have the same idea. So that often happens, especially when they split up. One of them might be thinking, wow, this therapy is just what we needed to clarify things. And the other's thinking, wow, what a disaster. I was hoping it would save our relationship. So it varies with the person. But, there are reasons. The reasons I say to split up, I basically, sort of oversimplifying guidelines. You divide all your problems into either deal breakers or growing pains. And if it's a deal breaker, and by deal breaker, I don't mean something that's just painful. I mean something that doesn't admit of a solution. Classic deal breaker is, and you'd be amazed the number of, maybe you wouldn't, the number of couples who've been together for 4 or 5 years, let's say younger folks in like 20s or 30s, they've been together 4 or 5 years. They've never talked about whether they want to have kids or not. And then somebody says, well, we're going to have kids, right? And the other says, I thought we agreed not to have kids. And they haven't agreed that at all. That's a classic deal breaker. If someone doesn't change their mind, there's no compromise possible. And if the one who doesn't, if either one gives in but doesn't really change their minds, they're just in for bitterness. It doesn't work. So that's a classic deal breaker. And there are other classic deal breakers too. But everything else is growing pains. So my one little bit of advice for a couple where it isn't working is if it's not a clear deal breaker, if it's not like, look, we know, or another one, it's a heterosexual couple and one of them says, turns out I'm gay. If they're sure about that, it's not going to work unless they decide like to have sex with other people, but that's tends not to work very well either. So those are classic deal breakers. Well, if it's not a classic deal breaker, if it's growing pains, what I tell people is, look, you may or may not end up splitting up, but don't split up too soon. And all I mean by too soon is don't split up before you've learned what you need to learn, because otherwise you'll just have to go through the same stuff with someone else.
What's the for because I know there's a lot of couples out there now, and especially with this generation, couples just have such a huge fights really over nothing. I've
Hmm.
witnessed some of the most ridiculous fights between couples and being in relationships. So, is there something that couples can do to help fix their relationship without having to go to couples therapy? Or is it kind of a thing where, even if it's something simple, that they do need to go to therapy?
Yeah. I smile when you ask that. You're asking an author, so I'm saying, oh, yeah, read my books, That's a rather self-serving answer, isn't it? Yeah, there are plenty of couples I don't, if they're not making appointments with me, I don't see them, do I? But there are plenty of couples that solve problems without having to go to therapy per se. What are the indications that it might be a good idea to go to therapy? Well, if they've tried stuff and it hasn't worked, but they actually still want to see if they can do it, that's when it's a good idea to go to therapy. But I don't think therapy is necessary for everybody. Yeah, and every once in a while, I haven't done this much. This was more true when I used to do individual therapy with folks than it is with couples therapy. Every once in a while, but even with a couple, I'll meet a couple where one or both of them are saying, "Well, we just think we should be in therapy. Everybody should be in therapy, and so we want to see you every month or two because we think that's a good tune-up." I understand that, but it's no fun for me. I'm not even blaming them. I'm just saying, yeah, that's not much fun for me. I want to help you if you really need help. To me that feels like, yeah, you guys should go read some books or do sign up for some nice couples retreats with people who like doing things like that. And again, I don't mean to sound dismissive, but I don't think everybody needs therapy all the time. I think therapy is useful for when you need it. Now, what often happens is one member of the couple wants to do couples therapy and the other doesn't. And that happens to be gendered in heterosexual couples. That is almost always, there are some exceptions, I've met exceptions, but it's almost always the woman wants to and the man doesn't. That is the rule way more than the exception. So much so that I actually made a video a couple of years ago called How to Get Your Reluctant Guy to Go to Couples Therapy. Uh, and the whole point of what I say, and actually that's a chapter in the book I'm working on now too. The whole point of that is if you're trying to convince your partner to go to couples therapy and they won't do it, the way to the way to possibly have that conversation isn't to yell at them and tell them how, what a lot of women will say is he doesn't care enough with me to do it. He doesn't care enough about me to do it. And that's almost never it. That's not it at all. That feels like that way to her because he's
Mhm.
saying, you're the one with the problem, you go. I don't need to be bothering myself with that. It sounds like he's just passing it off. The way that she could actually get him to maybe have the conversation is when she recognizes the reason he's resisting isn't because he doesn't care about her, it's because he's terrified of losing her. And he's terrified for good reason, which is the part that a lot of women are surprised about. He's terrified he's going to lose her because if you look around, and you may know folks like this, most of us do, look around among the couples you know who've gone to couples therapy, a lot of them have split up. A lot of them, and a lot of guys worry that if you go to couples therapy, the therapist is just going to take the woman's side and say the guy's a jerk. What are you with him for? And unfortunately, there are a fair number of therapists who do that. Sometimes it's sort of sexist that way, sometimes it isn't, but either way, there's a lot of therapists that people go to and say, "You're not happy, break up." And so the guy's terrified of that because he does care about her, not because he
Mhm.
doesn't. And so if she's able to recognize, wait a minute, you know what? I think I see why you're worried about this. This makes sense to me. He might then consider, okay, at least you're not saying I'm an idiot or a coward or something like that. You're understanding why this is worrying me. What do you want to go for? And she will say, yeah, because I'm really unhappy and I don't want us to break up, but I'm worried that we're going to. That maybe he can hear. It's like, wow, so maybe it's worth the risk. It is a risk, but it's worth the risk of trying it because I don't want to lose you. So, that is a common phenomenon.
I know therapy is usually um very much personal, but has there been an instance where you've had a couple come in and they have a problem and you kind of have a thing of really y'all have come to couples therapy for this problem? Is there like an instance that you can share where you're like, why are you guys in therapy?
Yeah. Um, that's an interesting question. That's a really interesting question. I don't tend to like to think that way. How's that? I think I certainly, well, I can answer this. I mean, certainly there are degrees of severity. I see that a lot, right? There are couples who come in, it's like, oh my God, I can see why you're having troubles. It's like, oh my
Yeah.
God, this is terrible. There are couples who come in, it's like, well, it's not nearly as terrible as that couple I was talking to a couple hours ago. You know what I mean? I
Hmm.
certainly see that. And they usually recognize that too. I don't think there are, at least off the top of my head, I can't think of couples where I'm thinking, what the hell are you doing here? That's if they're there, I don't think I've ever had anybody make an appointment with me sort of lightly. It's like this is nothing, but We just thought nobody's ever made an appointment with me just to tell me how well everything is going. The one actually it's funny. The one exception to that, there's been over 30 years, there've been, I don't know, 20 or 30 times, maybe one a year or so, off and on, where I'll do premarital counseling. It's the sort of thing that people used to go to their clergy for and still do if they have clergy. But a lot of folks don't have clergy or don't want to go to clergy for that. Their minister or their rabbi or their priest or whatever. So they'll go to a therapist, and I'm happy to do that. And so they're coming in saying, no, actually, we're getting married and we're actually doing well, but we want to avoid the pitfalls. I'm happy to help people with that. But that tends not to be long-term work. It's like we'll have a session or two or three to sort of cover things that they make sure that they've covered and they're fine.
Mhm. I feel like if I was a therapist, and I had a couple come in and it was the most outrageous thing, like, couples come in all the time for abuse, they come in for fights that get very physical. But if I had someone come in and they're like, ugh, he just doesn't like the hairbrush I use, I'd be like, really? You've come in for that?
Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
I've been like,
exactly. Do you ever see the Bob Newhart shtick called "Stop It"? You can check it out. Bob Newhart, he just died recently. Do you know who he was? A comedian
yes.
back from my era, and very funny guy. And he had this. He played a psychologist on TV. Actually, he had a TV sitcom back in the '70s where he played a psychologist. But he also had this comedy routine he would do where somebody would come in and they would start to describe their problem, and he would just say, "Stop it, stop it! I'm having this problem. Stop it!" It was very funny. But no, what I would do, I think, and this is kind of the therapist brain going here, if a couple comes in and she's saying he doesn't like how I use my hairbrush, I would be thinking, I'm going to take a wild guess that there's more to it than that.
Mm,
It's probably not about the hairbrush. There's something else going on here. You guys are irritating each other, and there's something happening that you're irritating each other, and you don't seem to be able to manage that. So my wife and I did a podcast last year where the setup was. And actually, you can relate to this. We have guests on our podcast too. Well, the guests didn't show. Turned out they had a family emergency, but we didn't know it at that moment. They just didn't show. So we're thinking, oh, gee, what do we do? So we wanted to still do the recording. We have our little schedule we like to adhere to. So I said to my wife, oh, I know, let's do a podcast about the one skill that solves all relationship problems. And she looked at me like, oh, really? Because she happens to be very intelligent. She knows that's nonsense what I just said. But nevertheless, I said, no, no, let's talk about that. So we did. So what is that one skill? I will spare your listeners having to look up our podcast. The one skill is the ability to be moderately annoyed. And that couple where they come in and she's saying, he doesn't like how I use my hairbrush or whatever it might be. Um, yeah, there's something more to it than that because the one thing that is a constant, I mean, it's not constant in terms of quantity, but the one thing that is true for everybody, we are all annoying. Everybody is somewhat annoying to other people, especially people you're really close to. I'm not being
mhm.
cynical. I'm not saying, oh, God knows I'm way more annoying than my wife is. I know that. That's true. She's very gracious about it, which is why she's really good at that skill that I just mentioned. I don't have to be nearly as good at that skill as she is because she's far less annoying than I am. But she's very good at that skill, and that helps us, because I can be really annoying. And it's that, and again, I'm making it sound silly, but actually underneath that message, I don't mean it in a silly way. That
Mhm.
couple you described, if they're seeing a therapist, and I charge money, they're paying good money to see me, to say that, it isn't just about that. It almost certainly isn't just about that. Or maybe even if it is sort of that, it's like, wow, that's interesting that you are holding your wife to that kind of standard, that how she uses her hairbrush is something that's going to bother you. Where'd that come from? And that'll work or it won't, but that's what I would tend to do with that sort of thing. So again, I can't think of I can think of lots of examples where it's less severe than other examples. And that's great. And then it's perfectly valid use of couples therapy. Just because you're not going through the worst possible stuff doesn't mean you're not feeling pain. It's real. I'm happy to help people with that. But something like that, it's usually, there's other stuff going on. We can find out about it.
Yeah, I just know for me being how I am, if I was a therapist and heard that, I'd have been like, What? And I would lose all professionalism and be like, really? I have problems like that too. But do I go to
Hmm.
therapy for that for couples? No.
Yeah.
It's like,
So again, if they are, I take people where they are. I start with where they are. I guess that's where I got to start with. If they're there, they think that's grounds for therapy. I take that seriously. Now, there have been couples. Well, again, not because it's trivial though. There have been couples when they'll ask me, should we come back? If they're asking me, because at the end of sessions, it's a little shtick I have. At the end of sessions,
mm,
I don't say, when would you like to come back? I say, would you like to come back? And if so, when? And the reason is I just right from the get-go, I'm saying you guys get to decide does this seem to be helping you? It's up to you. I don't assume you're going to be seeing me any particular number of times. I don't assume you're going to be seeing me weekly or any particular frequency. We just ask each time. It's like, what do you think? So every once in a while, a couple will say, well, do you think we should come back? And I will say, well, you know, therapist that I am, of course, therapists never
mm,
give anybody a straight answer, right? So I will say, "What do you think?" But what I mean by "what do you think" is, well, if you think if you're benefiting from it, sure. If you're asking me, do I think like, oh my God, if you don't come to therapy, you're in trouble? I don't see that. So, maybe why don't you just, sit on it, and if you feel the need, drop me an email. And if you don't feel the need, best wishes. It doesn't matter that much. I've had other couples where I would say, yeah, I think it's a good idea. It seems to me it's a good idea. It seems to me what we just did in this session would, from my perspective, looks like it opened up some important stuff. So that to come back after you've had a chance to sort of sit with this for a while is probably a good idea. So, I'll offer my opinion, but no, I don't. I haven't had folks saying like, really, you're here for that? Seriously, you're wasting my time and yours. What are you doing? I haven't had that experience. It's funny though because the way my wife is not a therapist, she's a retired educator. She's worked with lots of folks too, but not as a therapist. And she will often, if I talk about my work with her, she doesn't know who I'm working with, but I'll talk about talk about my day, and she will often be thinking in similar ways. It's sort of like, boy, if that were me, I'd just be telling him, more or less, you know, pull your head out of your rear end and get with it. And I
yeah.
tend not to work that way.
Kind of like a follow a question that's kind of similar to what we're talking about. When you do the therapy, couples therapy, do you tend to have more an uptake in couples before marriage, or do you have couples that usually come in after they get married?
Yeah. It's interesting. I have lots of couples who never get married, who have no intention of getting married, but they are couples. And that over 30 years, I've seen more and more of that. And if you look at the statistics on marriage in the United States, it bears that out, that it is now close to half. One statistic I remember I looked up a few years ago of women having babies, think about women having babies, about almost half of them are not married to the father of the child. And many of those who are not married are indeed coupled with that person. Do you know what I mean? They're not, it's not that they're single mothers, in effect. They're coupled, but they're not married. And that's by choice. And I've met lots of those couples where the woman wants to get married and the man doesn't, for all kinds of reasons. A lot of men are afraid of it. Again, I claim, yeah, I can understand their fear, even though I like marriage myself. I'm married and I like being married. But there's a lot of, especially men, more than women, who find it really scary because they look around them and they see people who seem to be doing fine until they got married, and then their relationship went to hell. So I'm not surprised that a lot of people are afraid of it, but that has over the years that has changed. What, 30 years ago even, I think it was already, well, this is more like 40 or 50 years ago, but I'm in my 70s. I easily remember 50 years ago. When I was a kid, certainly, there was a large stigma, a social stigma associated with having a baby and not being married. Not that people didn't do it, of course they did, but not nearly as much. So if you look at the statistics of women having babies back then, who were the proportion who were unmarried was way lower.
Mhm.
So over the years, now if you look at celebrities, look at stuff you see in the news, nobody bats an eye with the fact that somebody is having a baby and, they're with their fiance, or with their partner or whatever they want to say. It's just that has changed a lot. So in terms of, do I see people before marriage or after marriage? I see people who are married and I see people who are not married. I don't see, but that's not true. I do see a fair number of couples who are planning on getting married, but they haven't yet. I certainly do see that. They're engaged, but not married yet. Or and it's funny because that term engaged doesn't mean what it used to either. It used to be, back in my day when you got engaged, that you were in effect you're setting a date. Or you intend to set a date really soon. It's
Mhm.
like, well, we're engaged, meaning our intention is to have a marriage ceremony, and maybe we haven't picked the date yet, but we're going to pick it pretty soon, and we'll let you know. Now people say they're engaged with, and they don't seem to have any intention of ever actually getting married. It's like another status. It's like it's
Yeah.
defined as we're not the same as boyfriend and girlfriend anymore, but we are, doesn't mean we're planning actually on having a wedding ceremony anytime soon.
Yeah. Generations have changed significantly. It's more modern and more normalized where some people get pregnant and they don't ever plan on getting married. But if
Hmm.
this was back when my parents were around and even when my grandparents were around, that would be it would probably cause a lot of controversy for someone to have a child or get pregnant before they get married, and especially have a kid and never get married at all.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
times have changed so much where it's so normalized now where I could be having conversations and like, oh yeah, we're having a baby and we're not getting married, or we're planning on getting married, but we got pregnant before we did.
yeah.
It's so
That
normalized
was real
now.
common. In the old days, that was real common, but what they would do is get married right away.
Yeah.
That those are the stories where all of a sudden they're getting married, 6 months sooner than you thought. That happens a lot. That still happens occasionally, but less, way less than it used to.
Yeah, some people I know get engaged and not get married for 7 years.
Hmm.
And I'm like,
Yeah.
why are y'all? I understand for waiting terms, but again, if you engaged, I would expect y'all to get married within the year, sort of.
Yeah.
And
Fairly
I
soon,
and I get
Yeah.
that money's like tight right now, but I'm thinking,
Well, and see that it's always interesting to me because people say, well, we can't afford to get married. And I'm thinking, no, no, you can't afford to throw a big wedding, but it costs almost nothing to go down to City Hall and get married. Or or even do it with your local pastor or whatever. It doesn't cost much to get married if you want to get married. It costs a lot to have a big wedding, but you could get married and then have the wedding later when you can afford it. And I know people have done that actually,
hmm,
but a lot of folks don't want to do that because they want the actual wedding, the big wedding to be the meaningful time when they actually, get married.
right,
So
yeah.
so they'll wait.
It, I guess it comes down to personal preference at the end of the day. I mean,
Yeah.
everyone's so different. You know, weddings now too. And I don't know, if this has been an argument that you've had reoccur, but used to, it was women always took the man's last name.
Hmm.
And now it's more of I've heard people say they do a coin toss of which name they want to take. The one, the man actually ends up taking the woman's last name, or they just hyphenate the name.
Yeah.
Is that
There are cultures where that was common. There are not ours, but there are cultures where it was the commonplace thing for the man to take the woman's name. So it varies by
right?
culture. But yeah, that's true. You see all kinds of variations on that theme nowadays that you didn't used to see. And
Have you had
similar, yeah. So
have you
say,
had any fights related to that when it comes to maybe last names or
not so much. I don't recall couples fighting about that I can't think of couples I've worked with where they fought about that. They've made all those decisions you just described. I've seen them,
yeah.
but the one I have seen occasionally, not frequently, but occasionally, is a child of a couple that isn't married. And if the woman wants to use her name rather than the father's name, that's caused some real problems because
Mm,
that's bumped into, that is traditionally the case that even a couple, even a woman that has a child out of wedlock, as they say, the child would take the father's name. They used to be a term, you know, uh, you're having a child that doesn't have a name, or you having because if it's your own name, that doesn't count. It has to be the father's name. That's I've seen people argue about that, and especially if the mother's the custodial parent more, which is still usually the case, not always, but usually the case, and the father's really offended at her decision that says this kid's going to have my name, not yours. That's I've seen people fight about that one.
I can see that being like a huge fight, especially if they're not married.
Yeah. Yeah, it
I
feels
can,
to the father like he's just being cut out. He's just a
right.
sperm donor. And sometimes that's why she does it, because that's how she feels. That really is all he is. Maybe she's mad at him or whatever. I mean, there's all kinds of variations on that.
Yeah. To kind of wrap things up, I appreciate you so much for sharing some, but to my listeners and my listeners very much range from age and just backgrounds. Um, what do you have going on? And do you have if there's a couple out there that's listening to my show that is having um trouble with the relationship, if they've had like a problems with fights and whatnot, where can they find you and what platforms do you have to offer for them? Just feel free to plug everything.
Yeah, happy to do it. Thank you. Best place to go is my website, which is just brucechalmer.com. So if you spell my name right, you'll get it. BruceChalmer, brucechalmer.com. That has information about my practice. I can do coaching, pretty much anywhere by telehealth, and has information about my books as well, which you can get anywhere books are sold. And there's a link on there to our podcast. We also have a podcast website, CT in seven. So that's for couples therapy in 7 words. CTIN, the number seven, CTin7.com. That'll get you information about our podcast as well.
Well, and as always, I'll put all of his links. I'll put his website, podcast, his social media down below as well, so that all of his links are in one spot where it is easy access for you to find. Feel free to get me on social media, Instagram, TikTok, Lethal Venom Podcast, just to get more behind the scenes stuff, as well as get announcements of when new episodes are coming, as well as Facebook and YouTube. It's Noah's Podcast on there. I'll post updates on there as well. Make sure to follow Lethal Venom wherever you get your podcast from, on Spotify, Apple, Amazon, iHeartRadio, YouTube, Pandora. Just feel free to follow there, listen and follow on there so you'll be notified when new episodes drop. But I want to give a huge thank you to Dr. Bruce Chalmer for joining us today. I appreciate you so much for joining us and telling me some great advice, and hopefully some people out there will appreciate the advice.
Well, thank you, Noah. Thanks for having me on.
Appreciate you all for tuning in and showing support for the podcast, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of Lethal Venom.